start off by acknowledging the indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. I'm speaking from Edmonton in Alberta. Myself and the University of Alberta respectfully acknowledge that we are situated on Treaty 6 territory, traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people. While we meet on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands that we each call our home. So once again, hello and welcome to ICOI's second training session on, and the title is Research Ethics and Ethnocultural Communities, and it's presented by Dr. Satwinder Bains. Firstly, I would like to share that today's session has the option for closed captioning in English or French. And this feature is located in the Zoom chat box, and I see a note right there. And it'll open a separate window where you will see the transcription. So my name is Sandeep Agrawal, and I have the privilege to host the session and introduce our presenter today. I'm a professor and director of the School of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Alberta, and I'm also the chair of the Education and Training Committee and Economic Research Committee of ICOI. So ICOI is a short form of the Inclusive Communities for Older Immigrants Partnership. It is led by Dr. Sapali Guruj at Ryerson University, and is funded by SHRC, which is the Social Science Humanities Research Council. The project engages in a 7-year multidisciplinary, multi-sector, multi-province project. The aim here is to build sustainable connections to generate knowledge about social isolation and connectedness among older immigrants, support multi-directional knowledge exchange, and improve older immigrants' lives. So we are in the second year of the 7-year project. And this session, as well as the upcoming training sessions, are developed by the ICOI Education Training Committee. And the sessions will be held bi-weekly. And you can find more information about the sessions on the ICOI website, which is www.icoi.ca/news. So today's session will include, let's say, about 40 minutes of presentation, followed by the Q&A period. And this will give you the opportunity to ask questions and to get yourself more informed on the subject. You will also have the option to provide any questions through the Zoom chat throughout the presentation. So just throw in your questions as they are coming into your mind on the chat box there. I see that all of you have already muted your microphone as well as your video, which is a good thing. That's what I want. So at this point, I would like to introduce our presenter, Dr. Satwinder Bains. Her bio was attached to the description of the session. So I will not say too much, but just to quickly introduce her, Dr. Bains is the director of the South Asian Studies Institute at the University of the Fraser Valley, and is an associate professor in social cultural media studies in the College of Arts at the university there. Her current research interests include migration, settlement and integration, cross-cultural education, curriculum implementation, race, racism, ethnicity, South Asian diaspora here in Canada, and more specifically the Punjabi cultural historiographics. So the other thing I want to say is that Satwinder is a member of the economic research stream of ICOI, and she's also a member of the Education and Training Committee that has put this session together. So welcome, Satwinder, and thank you very much, and floor is all yours.
Thank you, Sandeep, for those kind words and for allowing me to share this platform with all of you. And especially thank you to Gareth and Jared, who have managed and to get us all here and done all the work behind the scenes. It's really, really important to recognize that. Thank you to both of you and to Sipali as well for her leadership in this project. I also want to start by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the unceded and ancestral territory of the Stolo Nation. They are the people of the river, the Halkamilam speaking people, and they have been here since time immemorial. And I work very hard at the Institute as well as at the university to ensure that we start to understand their rights-based position and to work as an immigrant community in the Valley around our own understanding of displacement and our position as settlers. So this is a lot of work, and we are working hard to understand our own position, but also to find ways to build reconciliation and truth within our communities. As you know, BC is rife with the work that needs to get done and rife with lots of problems that have happened in the past. I want, as Sandeep said, I'll be with you for 35 minutes in the talk, and then we can open up for questions. I hope, Gareth, the slides can be made available to anybody who wants them after the talk. And please keep your questions current so that you can remember what you want to ask me. I want to start by saying this is an area of study that's really an imperative area in multicultural Canada, and it needs more and more understanding and building of training as well as education around how you work with ethnocultural communities, and especially in the Shirk field and in NSERC. So I'm going to screen share some of my slides with you. So we can start with that. There we are. And then, can you see it, Gareth? Do you see it in slide mode or in the other from?
It's not in slide mode, Satwinder. So you'll have to.
Now?
No. Yes, now. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So that's just my cover page, but this is the type of stuff that I wrote that we will be discussing today, and I'm not going to repeat it. That's in your presentation package. And what I just want to add is that, it would be great to hear commentary as well as experiences and questions from the floor in terms of what others have learned along the way. This is a little bit of an uncharted territory for Canada and for the world. So we are learning as we go along. And it's something that we have to work together so that we can all learn from each other. So I think the premise of my talk is really about community involvement. My 40 years of working in this field has been prefaced and foundational around involving the community in every step of the research cycle. I know that now with ethics, that is a requirement from Shirk that we don't make assumptions that communities will come on board when we want them to. As researchers, but that we build them into our research cycle. And it's clear that any results, could be harmful if we didn't do that. So that's just a preface. And this is from a book written by Mohat and Thomas that is quite an excellent resource if you were to start somewhere. It has a number of chapters that you can build your knowledge from. So I'm going to start with hold one second. With encouraging that, the ethical decision-making questions that might come to your mind. So these are questions that we mull over as we start developing research ideas. And so the first one is really, what steps can we take to incorporate a cultural perspective? And that, I think, requires a fair bit of thinking and to also understand your assumptions. So this work around ethnocultural communities is also about the researcher. It's not just about the research communities. It is about our perspectives, our research ideas, and what we know and what we don't know. And this is probably the hardest time to be most honest. This is the time when we really need to look at ourselves and understand our position. So start from there. What steps can we take to incorporate this perspective into the evaluation, and what are the risks and benefits? And how can we develop and implement respectful, informed consent as a premise that is a really important part of our research cycle, as you are aware, I'm sure, but really this idea of respect, and it's going to come up later in the slides as well. And what do we need to consider when constructing culturally sensitive confidentiality and disclosure policies? I assume everybody at the universities have research boards, that ethics research boards that help guide you through this process. And SSHRC itself has overarching guidelines as well. But the cultural sensitivity around confidentiality and disclosure is really critical. And I would suggest that your boards at your universities should be very, very aware of these areas so that they themselves can guide your applications. So it's a bit of a hierarchical top-down idea that at the top, everybody needs to know this as well, not just you as a researcher. And so what are the pitfalls, and successful approaches to engaging? Hopefully we'll get through what we need to discuss about these ethical issues when we make decisions about research. Second. Okay, so I've got 4 areas that I think I can cover easily in half an hour. I hope one is research design, one is collection, one is analysis and interpretation. And all this through this lens of ensuring that culturally meaningful and ethically sound outcomes are expected and are required through your work. So CMES is an area that we all need to be aware of. So there are first steps for CMES, and along the way, these are things perhaps you need to consider. So, this is a very important one about how to gain access. So as you know, we have already a hierarchical position in terms of our power and privilege as researchers. And so the how to gain access to ethnocultural communities, the processes you use are really, really critically important. And you need to really think about those and bend your mind around the ethical issues about how to gain access. And the second part attached to that is how to gain credibility. So when you do have access, what is your credibility in the process? And I think the times have come and gone when our names and our positions as university researchers were enough. I think we have to prove our credibility and ensure that credibility through action and through our other means that we can build with our communities. And that'll come up later in the slides as well, how to do that. And weighing the value of selective sampling versus randomized sampling. So I'm really interested in the idea that we don't generalize and that we create as large a pool of research of subjects as possible so that we don't have stereotypical views that come out in the outcomes. So be aware of what processes you use to create sampling for yourself. And then, number 4 is really about incentives. Ethnocultural communities, not all, but a number of ethnocultural communities in Canada anyway, come from collectivist cultures. So, incentivizing them to join the research is something you have to really weigh and think about what would be of value to them. Is a $25 gift certificate to Walmart, is that going to make the incentive? Or is it babies? Is it time for childcare? Is it getting them out of the home into a place where they meet other people? You need to look at what is it that would create incentivization for these communities, for people in these communities that would have long-term impact and benefit, not just for your project, but for the longer term. And then obviously obtaining valid informed consent in ways, and we'll talk about that later as well. Selection of instruments with relevant norms. This is really critical. There are too many instruments that are Eurocentric and have a Western model of how we go out and expect things to happen. And we need to question as well as redesign our instruments and find ways that ensure that there's cultural relevancy in those instruments. Assuring and ensuring that the translation has a metrical equivalence, that we have spent the time to assess this cross-cultural equivalence of that translation. That is really, really important. And all translation be done through a professional degree of understanding. Interpreting data within the proper cultural context, goes without saying. The context needs to be really understood from the beginning, and the cultural context should be built into your project from the beginning. And I guess I'm highlighting respect and trust as one of the key elements. Just going to keep an eye on the time. This is the principle that underlies problems of ethics. Respect as underlying universal principle, about treating others with the same respect that you would expect for yourself. Generally, if there is respect, you won't get into any serious trouble. But if there's no respect, that no matter what you do, it'll dog you along the way, and you will not get the results that you are looking for. So respect and trust, I think, are cornerstones and key to the success of the research that you're going to undertake. And then informed consent. Do study participants understand the reasons behind the use of informed consent? The work that we do in the Valley, where I work, we have a very large South Asian Canadian population, and we have all 4 cohorts. We have, the first migrants who came to Canada in the early 1900s. We have a few of them left, very few now, but we still have a community of people who came in the early 1900s. And then we have, the large bulge of immigrants who came in the 70s, who came due to liberalization of immigration. And then we have, Canadian-born, their Canadian-born children. And then we have the new immigrant that's always arriving. So I think you have to understand how to get informed consent from these communities, and there shouldn't be one size fits all. You have to understand your communities and ensure that the words you use, the technical scientific jargon you use to describe the aspects of the form for informed consent is understandable. The flow and length of sentences and paragraph structure, it seems very rudimentary, but readability index is usually very high on our forms. And we need to simplify that language for ethnocultural communities, not dumbify it, but simplify it, plain English and plain language and other, if you're translating the information. And I think one of the things we've really worked on is to have informed consent through oral explanations as well. So that helps as well, meeting the researcher, meeting the people online or in person. Getting informed consent that way is also something that's valuable, because you spend the time to ensure that people understand. Again, back to the hierarchical position of the researcher, that their position and privilege somehow might also be a barrier to informed consent, that informed consent is given under duress or under a sense of, not feeling equipped enough to question. So oral consent is also good to use as a tool. If you know the community's language. If you don't know the language, then bring in certified interpreters who can help you to do that. And I would also say that your interpretation crew that you've hired, whether they're consultants or people you hire on an hourly basis, they have to have this training as well. There is sometimes an imbalance in terms of their own power and privilege in the community. So you want to ensure that the translators and interpreters that you hire have also received training around ethnocultural communities, because it's not just an assumption we must make that because they belong to those communities that they have the knowledge, all the knowledge in terms of what they need to impart. So this areas of research that they need to understand as well. So we build in the training for interpreters, and of course, over time you build a pool, and that pool can really be resourceful for you. So understanding the implications of signing an informed consent or refusing to sign, do they have the right to withdraw or complain, and do they understand what that right is? It is very easy to put it down on paper, and we must do that through our ethical practice. But, are we really ensuring that the subject understands that they have the right to withdraw, and that we respect and honor that right to withdraw, and that if it is areas of, especially of confidentiality and as a given, but also around discomfort, that you have your antennas out as well, that you're aware that there's discomfort and that you will withdraw as well and not bludgeon on. And the last one is really about, is translation accurate? Is weighted value attached to it? And is it double vetted? We must ensure that the translated materials that we receive are accurate, and that that value has not been attached by the translator, that the translator has used ethical practices in the translation. And that's some training that you can give to the translators and interpreters. Okay. Ownership of data. So community members may not understand who owns the data and who has the right over the data. too often I find, and I know this is not an ICOI's mandate, but too often I find that we're mining data without really building long-term sustainable relationships that the data is continuously shared as well, that the data has value to the communities, that the data, then its results and outcomes are then shared. We are asked in our applications how we will disseminate the data, and we do say we will let the respondents receive the data after the fact, and we will share it. But I think by the time we write our reports and are publishing our papers, the subjects have kind of disappeared off the scene, and we haven't really spent the time to go and let them know what the data is. So I think there's, from what my experience is, that there is not confusion, but there is a kind of ambivalence about, who owns this data, and then what happens to this data? What happens? Who has the rights over it? How is it used? And ethnographic data may be generalized, which has to happen at some point if we continue to do this work. But if there's limited understanding of the social structures of the communities that you're working with, that's an ethical dilemma for you. And if there's no accountability on that data that we talked about, that's an ethical dilemma for you. And the last one is really critically important, that sometimes the interests of the larger community, meaning us as researchers or our university or our departments, or our societal values may be at odds with individual needs. I know, for example, that, in the domestic violence field, let's say 20 years ago, there was a repeated kind of question and expectation from researchers that, not expectation so much, but a kind of results-oriented discussions from researchers that, while women don't want to leave domestic violence situations, that there was a pejorative attached to that, as if the women had no agency. There was a kind of write-off. They were writing them off as if they were never going to leave, and there was this stigma was attached to those women. And we have to be careful that that's not of course, to us as researchers in the field, we may think that's the only solution, is to leave the partner. But there is, other collectivist cultural considerations that women have to take into play. And, do we understand those? Do we come in with sensitivity? Do we come in with light feet rather than stomping in? Do we understand the stigma that communities face? And Western culture may have moved away from those stigmas, but that doesn't mean that those stigmas don't exist. And so really having a deeper understanding and a greater understanding of social structures is really, really key. And I know researchers tell me, how can we know everything? And it's really hard. But if you're invested in the research cycle and you're invested in that research area, then you have to do the work. You have to understand the cultural considerations of those communities. Mistranslation of material, and I keep coming back to this around, is true and authentic information obscured through translation and interpretation? So it's a very complicated question. We don't have a lot of answers for. How do you ensure that the translation interpretation is true and authenticated? It costs more and more money. I haven't seen a lot of research proposals that ask for a double vetting of translation because it's very costly. But we, as we, in this research work, we have to, if we get on adjudicating boards, etc., we have to raise that awareness that that is a budget item and that it should be included in the budgetary cycle. So that's something I highly recommend. There is also a deep concern about representation by outsiders. I know in the ethical discussion, we usually disclose our outsider position and ensure that that's understood. But have we understood it, and do we then find ways to mitigate the impact of our outsider position? group categories. This comes up a lot. BC, in the province of BC, we are going through a community consultation process around anti-racism legislation. And census data is about the only thing we have right now around race-based data. And the province wants to start to ensure that institutions and organizations like universities and others start to look at race-based data. And so, the big question of how do you create categories? What categories are important? But there are these static constructions of community groups is really, really problematic, and to really understand why, for example, in Abbotsford, where I live, we have an east-west divide. We have actually a line going right through the city center that kind of divides ethnocultural groups and ethnicities. And we've really boxed people in because of that. And it's really hard to break down those stereotypes and those discriminations based on those stereotypes around east-west divide, just in a local community of like 150,000 people. So you can imagine how much more complicated it is when you go out and start to study a community or do research with the community. So just to be aware that group categories can be problematic, and that you ensure that what categories you provide to people are deeply understood and are vetted with the communities as well. So these categories, for example, like whether communities have high acculturation or low, or are very traditional, whether there's high ethnic density versus low ethnic density, there is never black and white. Nothing is black and white. There's so much nuance, and ensuring that nuance and that strength of community needs to be built into the outcomes of your research and understanding of the research as you undertake it in the beginning. This kind of many words in our lexicon we use without understanding the implications of those words on those communities, and to show really ethical responsibility not to do that. So this idea of ethnic gloss, which is the idea that there are simplistic pan-ethnic labels without, as I said, understanding the deep nuances and cultural differences that happen within communities. Using words like Asian, Black, Latina, these are relevant terms, but there needs to be a deeper breakdown. There needs to be a larger breakdown of those communities, and then understanding their positionality through that breakdown. So we do have the dilemma in Canada about hyphenation and community affiliation. So it's something we're all struggling with. We're not all there yet. We haven't quite understood how to do that. Do we say South Asian Canadian, or do we say Canadian of South Asian descent? We're still struggling with all those terms that kind of explain our positions at a period of time. Do we say South Asian because you're a new immigrant? Do you attach Canadian? Do you leave that? Do you leave South Asian? Just call everybody Canadian? So we're all working through these challenges of ethnic gloss that we're facing, and there are no easy solutions to these. But broad brush categories are an insult to the dignity and richness of the cultural fabric of the ethnocultural communities. And so spending time in the development phases of your research proposal and research ideas to really understand the cultural nuances and the richness and the beauty of these communities is critical to your success, and to your success as a return scholar to those communities, if you're going to keep going back to those communities and to build that deep engagement. Again, one size fits all does more harm than good. And the last point, just about sharing information with the communities who are directly involved or immediately affected by the dissemination of research results. I know initially when I started out in this field of my communities that I work with in my region, I remember being asked, there was this, it's taken time, but I mean, initially I remember people asking me that I was going to speak to about our project, saying, just because you asked the question, about, say, for example, we were studying safety of ethnocultural communities in largely dominant white community of, strong Christian values, want to know how safe people feel. And some of the people would ask me just because I had asked the questions that the outcomes that they expected, for example, to feel less safe was something in my control, that I was going to now create programs or services or let government know or talk to the mayor or go and speak to this committee. And that was never my role. So it's really even just getting into the communities around the idea of research and what research really means is also something sometimes we have to explain, because communities have not understood the cycle of the idea of research, but also what happens to the research and where it ends up. And so at my university, we undertake a lot of applied research, and that applied research gives us great opportunities to then apply the results somewhere, but not all research, obviously, is going to do that. Socially sensitive research, understanding the issues of individual autonomy, family responsibility, affiliation, cultural values and norms goes without saying. You really deeply need to understand that. Entering the community as an outsider, parachuting in and out, and addressing the persistent problem of research fatigue, and research exploitation at some point. You must keep building bridges rather than taking the bridge with you when you leave. So, ensuring that there's deep and abiding relationships that you need to build. It's not a parachuting in and out. That just has no value. I know sometimes we have to do that. We go in for a short period of time and we're out, but you need to build those bridges and to how to channel effective programs within communities research. So that's that question of how do you then take your research and make sure it applies to those communities. Moral dilemma of being privy to a very personal information for vulnerable groups. So there's a dichotomy in this, that as an insider in my community, in my South Asian cultural community in Abbotsford and in the Fraser Valley, I'm privy to very personal information and I know a lot of people. So there is I have to be very, very careful that none of my learning, through my research, affects anyone around that personal information. So building trust and around the confidential issues that people have to share. First, do no harm. Obviously, as a very foundational premise, take time to understand the ideas of historical, political, the issues of migration, of language, of geography, all that about cultural communities. Build that knowledge, that corpus of knowledge before you start. Researchers can't bring their hands and say, I don't know. There has to be that development phase that takes you to that point. And be aware of presumptive vulnerabilities. Be aware that there are vulnerabilities and there is societal bias, and give due credit to cultural agency and historic knowledge. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. The work around prenatal education for minority groups received a lot of criticism because what Western researchers were doing were imposing Western values on prenatal work with ethnocultural communities, and they were not giving good credit to the historic knowledge that families and communities brought with them. So rating high on the to-do list is meriting participant trust, creating a transactional model for addressing participant rights and investigator responsibilities. We aren't doing that enough. I think we have a huge assumption that our ethical responsibility is deeply understood by ethnocultural communities. I can guarantee you it is not. So making sure that our responsibility as researchers is also imparted and that they agree to that position as well. And then this is about institutional power, recognizing our privilege and the privilege of institutions that are mostly run by white dominant communities, understanding that privilege and creating fair and respectful research, creating a coda that emphasizes the important significance of moral imperatives, and embodying values that community members and researchers both can find acceptable. And meanings for researchers may not coincide with the worldview of a culture different and foreign to them, but as long as we show respect and trust that that is what they believe and this is what we believe, Ethical planning, points for consideration are not intended to serve as regulation, policy, or absolute prescriptions for research. So the goal is to assist you in building responsible conduct. So, for us, we want, as I said earlier, the hierarchical positioning of who gives the right to do research. All those groups and individuals need to have this cultural sensitivity training to make decisions. So it's not just the researcher educating the REB, the Research Ethics Board, but for the board itself to have that ethical training as well. So institutional buy-in, and it's hard to do that at a university, a very large university, but perhaps a little bit easier at smaller universities to get that accomplished. Some vulnerabilities that you need to be aware of. They're not a tick-offs. They're not like, okay, I'll tick all these off and I've done my job. That's not what we're aiming for. But these are some of the things you need to be considering when you look at minority groups, understanding the vulnerability of their language, of education, of their status. Sometimes they are in limbo, legal limbo as well. And what does that mean if they're refugees or they've come from some other illegal ways into Canada? So what does that status mean to them? Effects of dominant group discrimination. We don't always pay attention to that. The idea of what the host community, what Canada, its position as well as a body, as a nation, as a state with its policies. What is that? How does that impact the vulnerability of communities? And opportunity, socioeconomic status, gender, power, systemic institutional discrimination. These are all areas that you need to address around when you start your research proposal. So what can you do? As I started in the beginning, you must do some self-reflection and introspection. I think that's a key factor that must impact you when you start your research thinking. Recognize there are diverse values and deeply engaged with that learning. That's a given, that's a premise, that's a foundational core principle. Be aware of errors of judgment, be aware of those so that you can reduce the assumptions that you have in your mind and mitigate them over time. Share lessons with others, really, really important what you learn, share it with others, have courage and generosity of spirit, have respect and trust in everything that you do, and continuously challenge and expand the ever-changing landscape. I think this type of research is really exciting and really needed in Canada. We need to build more capacity around ethnocultural communities research. I know in my own subcultural community, we have a dearth of knowledge and we are constantly building it. So we need to do more and more and more. So this is an area of real passion for me. And I encourage all my graduate students and other students to continue into this trajectory of studying the South Asian Canadian community because there is so little written on them and so little researched. So I'm very happy with the ICOI program that will study, older immigrants through this, 7-year process. That is really important for me, and for SSHRC to understand that these are our communities and that the strength of this work will impact all of us across Canada. And then as a researcher, huge expectation from the subject and from us as a group of scholars is to challenge the stigmatization that happens for communities and the cultural attitudes, societal biases, and systemic and individual privilege. Oh, so that's a lot I've said in a short time. And I feel like I've just kind of thrown it out for you to absorb and adjust. But this is an area I want to say that is something that is continuously being developed. And so ideas that you have are something that I think we should all encourage to share. And I hope our program, our research project, through the work that we're doing, will allow knowledge to be built up so that we can go back to it and share from it. So I think the sharing of knowledge is really, really critical. And I thank you for, allowing this to happen so we aren't working in our little corners, but that we have a larger sharing platform. And so I have my email here if you so desire. I'm always open for more questions after the fact. It would come to you later. I would be happy to answer them if they come up, and obviously always happy to hear about your experiences and how I can build my own scholarship. Thank you. So I'll take questions. It's 9:44. I'm right on the dot. So you have about half an hour, 25 minutes to ask me questions. Welcome, Sipali. I just see you just now. Thank you for coming.
Oh, thank you. I have been here since the beginning of your presentation.
Oh,
Thank
you.
so
I
much.
just had a small faces on the side, so I couldn't see everyone.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Amazing presentation. Thank you.
And I should have said thank you to all the participants as well. My mistake that I didn't say that, but thank you for taking time out of your valuable schedules and joining us today.
Thanks very much, Satwinder. I mean, that was an excellent presentation. You raised some very important points about considerations related to ethical, moral values and practices in our research, especially in social science research. And this is a time for the participants to put your questions in the chat box, or use the Zoom feature to raise your hand, and then we'll take up your question. We have plenty of time for at least half an hour with Satwinder. So while we are all thinking about the questions, here are a few things that I wanted to say, Satwinder, and perhaps gets your reaction to them. One of your points was quite pertinent when you said something in regards to some situation where you approach this group and somehow they thought that you're going to solve their problem, right? I mean, I have seen that myself. I've researched on Syrian refugees, and again, so vulnerable population, Afghani refugees, and when you go to them and they suddenly think, oh my gosh, this research is going to provide them the employment or somehow solve their problem that the family or individual is facing. So I think it's a very good point that you made, that we need to make it very clear that we may not be able to do that immediately, but hopefully over time, we can influence the policies and programs to take care of things. But here is my question to you. I'm just trying to contextualize this. It goes back to informed consent. What my experience, especially working with ethnocultural communities, they would say, well, listen, I trust you.
Yeah.
I'm not going to sign on any piece of paper. So I find that disconnect between what the university research boards require. You have to go through the entire process, and where I am, it's like a 20-page form, and it takes weeks and weeks and weeks to get approved. But the practice of research is very different. So I guess I have two sort of questions. There's the disconnect between how university RAB, Tri-Council guidelines are, and how the practice actually plays out, research practice. And then there's this whole issue of informed consent. So if you could just sort of reflect on these practical realities that researchers face on a day-to-day basis.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Sandeep. I'll start with your first commentary about the sharing experiences. About how the expectations of scholars. So what we have of communities, what we have learned over time is to involve other stakeholders in our research. So when we looked at language planning, for example, for new immigrants, we brought in our community service agencies into the research, and then they also were fortunately armed with kind of our research to make the pitch to government. So researchers staying in the ivory towers and putting out papers and publishing and talking to each other is not enough. I mean, we need to bring in, for the applied part of it in social sciences, we really need to bring our stakeholders. So for us, what has worked in a small community like Abbotsford has worked is that we're even in the initial stages of developing our research proposals, we go to the stakeholders, say, these the right things we're looking for? Are the Syrian refugees really want to know this? Like, are we on the right track? What are the things you're hearing and doing on the ground? So developing our research proposals, we bring the stakeholders in, and then somehow that has helped a little bit where the immigrant population or ethnocultural communities kind of say, okay, you're not going to be providing the services, but there are other groups and I could go here, or, so I think our research can be really useful in that work. And I think we need to do some of that and not stay so removed from it. And that's one part. But the idea of informed consent is really important, because as you say, once you have built the trust, then they don't understand this contractual agreement, that the university requires. And it's unfortunate that we have, well, it's fortunate, unfortunate. I mean, it's good practice for us to have that record, because say the research went sideways, we still can say, we had asked you. Anyway, it's complicated. I don't think we have an answer for it. And that's why I said oral consent is really, for me, has really worked well, because I walked them through it. I explained to them what all is required from my side, and that, this protects their position, it protects their knowledge, it protects me from taking advantage of that knowledge down the road, and it gives them some comfort in knowing that I have put my signature on the page, and that their signature and my signature is a contractual kind of agreement. Collectivist cultures don't always value contracts. Their word of mouth and their the power of our handshake or a relationship, or the kind of giving of a promise is considered to be enough. But this is a dilemma. It is something we have to get around. Now, over time, over 40 years of working in the community, people have understood it. Not everyone. We're obviously meeting new people all the time, but people have understood kind of the university's goal and role. And it's been, unfortunately, Sandeep, with litigation, this is going to become even more worse and worse over time. It's not going to reduce, it's going to increase this continuous need to make sure everything is dotted and crossed, and which I truly understand the reasons for. But for me, the layering of that respect and trust over time is what gets me through the difficult times. I have a calling card that is much wider than just that one person. A lot of people have my reputation, they know what I do, and that helps. There is a grapevine, a very strong grapevine within ethnocultural communities, and that grapevine, once broken, once there's a rift in it, it's very hard to repair. So that's why I say that, build your trust and respect and maintain it, and then go back to those communities. Don't stay in isolation, involve them. So when we do our research projects, at the end of it, when we come out with our results, we have a seminar, we have a workshop, we go to them. We don't just bring them into the university. It's scary coming into universities. We go to them, present our work in simple language. We bring chai and samosas, and we say, okay, let's all sit and talk around tea. So it's not so much I'm lecturing to you, but I'm sharing what I found, and this is what I know. And they may disagree or agree with the findings, but at least I've shared. So I think it's a very layered and very complicated dance that we're involved in. And there are missteps, and we step on each other's toes, but we have to do this work. Yeah. There's nothing, you can't prevent it, you can't stop it.
Yeah, no, nicely said. And again, we are open to questions. Please put in your, okay. I see a question from Bharati. Bharati, please go ahead. You can say your question.
Or an experience. It doesn't have to be a question. Even I would love to.
Yeah, or a comment, yes.
No, I have a question. Thank you for your presentation. It's such an important topic, especially with vulnerable populations. So you discussed two aspects of ethics. One is the representation of the community, and second is our moral, legal, and professional conduct. I'm really interested in the ongoing debate on reciprocity in ethics of research, and not just in quantitative, that access to post trials, but really being very intentional in our research reciprocation, especially with vulnerable communities. And my second related question is, you talked about translation and having professional, and I know that the tri-council agencies, you have to put in the proposal of training students. But I wondered about peer researchers as one of the ways of reciprocation in ethics in research.
I agree with you, Bharati, totally on your last point. I think you have brought up a very important point for Canada, which is we don't have this peer network of ethnocultural community. I'm hoping that Sapali's project will create that network as well for us to continue to build our relationships with each other. So I'm in agreement with you that peer, outside of the peer review of publications, before that happens, I would love to see more work being done by us to support each other in our work, and to say, is this what the translation said? Is this correct? I think we can build that into our proposals. We should be asking each other to support each other through this site, through this process. And I'm with you on that, in agreement with you, Bharti. And the idea of reciprocity is a very, very, very important one that we consistently must build into our thinking and into our planning. Our position as researchers is so powerful and so influential that we have such a great opportunity to take that position and do something with it. I feel like there's still a disconnect between the university and the communities, and that's just the nature of the institutions. We tend to connect with our research assistants and others who work for us in our offices, but beyond that, we haven't really built. I feel anyway in our communities, the university hasn't done enough of that. So building that moral imperative for us to understand our communities and really build long-term sustainable relationships, there is so much benefit in that. I know we are reaping the rewards of that. I'm on the island right now in Vancouver Island, and we're visiting Paldi, which is a small town near Duncan, BC, if people know the island a little bit. And there's actually no one living there very much anymore. It's a ghost town. But when we arrived, and we had not just arrived yesterday, but had been coming for a number of years, by now the community, it took us almost 6 years, but the community yesterday, finally said, where can we sign? We want to sign with you. What are you going to do with us? And what should we do with you? And they want to build their historical narratives. They want to build an archive. They want to build a museum. They want to build a community network. And, it's very, very satisfying that it took that long, but we needed to do that. We need to be at pace. Our pace needs to match theirs. Sometimes we're impatient and our pace doesn't always match theirs. And the other thing that happens, we get disheartened. We stop doing the work. But if we can find a sliver of space on our desk to continue that relationship, that reaps real rewards for us. And I really want to talk about this human fulfillment that we create through our research. And I think for me, that's the most important thing.
Thank you.
Thank you. I see a comment in the chat box. It's basically to thank you for your interesting, practical, thought-provoking talk. Look forward to reflecting on what you have shared. So this person has left, Melissa has left. For the rest of you, we are still open for questions. I know there's some students here as well. And this session is quite pertinent to you, because most of the time it's you folks who are out there as the frontline folks, dealing with such issues. So feel free to.
I also want to say, one of the things I want to say, Sandeep, is that within institutions, I think as researchers, we also have a role to play. And maybe I glossed over that a little bit, just around our questioning of equitable principles. So, we need to go to the HREB and ask, give us an ethnographic audit. Like, tell us how many researchers at our university are studying ethnocultural communities who live in our communities. What is the response of the university to our communities? We continue to perpetuate the research we've done over a period of time and build, of course, we build, more knowledge, but there are many communities who are suffering from no knowledge. And the university needs to be current. It needs to be more in pace, in line, in awareness about who are we serving, like who are our communities. And so I notice, people in the ICOI group, we're looking at immigrant serving groups and, layering our research with inclusive ways of including our communities. And what I think one thing we should be doing at all our universities, and we're asking for that through the legislation, in BC, is to have reporting from institutional research around the kinds of research that universities are putting out. And we want to do an audit on the research in our universities. I don't think enough of that is done.
No, that's a very good point. I hadn't thought of that. But again, goes back to what you had said earlier, that we should not, and by we, I'm saying researchers, scholars, and university, to raise communities' expectations just because they have been researched, that something will just change immediately, right?
Yeah.
We are just a catalyst, but we are not the decision makers of the change that they may be looking for.
Mm.
There is a question here, and again, I don't want to gloss over this one. This is from Ryan. What are some strategies to build trust and connections with ethnocultural communities during the context of COVID online recruitment?
Mm. Yes, we're facing that. In fact, we're doing COVID research right now, and we're asking anti-vaxxers for parents who have children between 5 and 11. Like, we're asking, okay, who are against vaccination, who are for? So we're trying to understand, the reasons for mothers, mostly mothers and fathers or caregivers of the children. Like, what are their reasons for not getting the vaccination and for getting the vaccination? So it's been a huge challenge, to get both parents into a room through a Zoom call. And I have to say, Sandeep, what has helped us and what has really supported us has been our past. Our past forays into the community have been well developed, have been well thought out, have not been provocative, have not been exploitative. They have been supportive of the community's needs. We have advisory committees that guide us through, like we have one on social justice, we have one on criminal reform. So those advisors are also really good conduits for us. So you need to find ways to enter, and once you enter, you need to find ways to consolidate that entry in a respectful and long-term, relationship building and credibility building manner. So what has helped us has in the COVID times certainly has been that we've had a reputation. That's helped for sure. Our calling card, does help. But the other piece that's really helped has been to that question I put about incentives. We have this, while there's been it's a dichotomy. There's two things going on. One is people have been laid off their work, right? There's a lot of people who are unemployed, but there's also been where people have been getting CREB and are getting, benefits, and they really don't want to work. So we have a challenge in our communities about how to incentivize people to come and be part of focus groups or give interviews or answer surveys. And I would say the best strategy we've employed in COVID times has been the incentivization of, we've given gift cards, we've given daycare coupons. Not a lot of people are at home, they're not working. We've given gym. The gyms have closed down in BC for a while. We gave gym coupons out. I don't know, it's complicated. I don't think there was any of us had thought how difficult this would be to bring people on. The other challenge we faced was second challenge. The larger one was people were not, some of the elders and people who have less technological capabilities couldn't come onto Zoom. Like, we had challenges getting people onto Zoom. And so we had to find a conduit to say, okay, so one thing we did, we have a lot of processing plants, agricultural processing plants where a lot of people work. And we were doing the study of temporary farm workers who come to work on farms. And through COVID and what the temporary farm workers faced in terms of challenges. So we called them into the canneries, and then the cannery staff set up the computers, and they went in front of the computers, but not everybody has access to that. Like, not everybody can go to it. So that was a tool we used. And we had 100 temporary farm workers in a building. And then we had the computers there, and they came turn by turn, every 45 minutes, another person came and they gave their interview by Zoom. But not everyone has those capacities to do that. So I'd love to hear other people's experiences. I don't think we have all the answers, but continually building on our reputation has been one. We've had the phone calls we make are generally through people who speak the language. So, finding the ethnocultural communities you're working with, finding people who have the language skills to help them understand the questions and understand even getting through the door, answering even a initial survey to say, are you eligible to be part of our group? We had other people fill that out for them.
No, that's very good. Now back to your, some of the ideas you gave about how to incentivize people to participate. I wanted to add to your example. So we were doing our research on homelessness in the Northwest Territories within the indigenous communities. And so we were interviewing these folks who are literally homeless, nowhere to go. And we decided to give them $200 each. Now, the issue was that they were on government support. So as soon as they received $200, it would have been taxed.
Taken off.
Yeah, $200 get taken off from their government support.
Yeah.
So what we decided to do is not to give them cash, but actually just give them the coupon for a particular grocery store where they could go and actually buy the food that they needed. So I think, so I think you have some very good ideas that you provided.
Yeah, we have temporary farm workers from Mexico and Guatemala, and we didn't know what to give them either. And so we gave them, they had to go into 2 interviews, one pre and one post. And we gave them $100 for the pre, but we gave it through a direct deposit to a Western Union. And then Western Union sent that money straight to Mexico. It was a bit complicated, but we got it done. That money went to Western Union, then Western Union split the money up into $100 bills, and then getting ethics to approve all that was just like heck. And then the second time, if they did the second interview, they got the next 100. So that was incentive for them to stay with us, to tell them, okay, post the season, what were the policy implications? How did you manage? Did you have challenges, etc.? What were those challenges? And so they, we had 99% return rate because only one man didn't interview because he left early. But everybody else before they left for Mexico came and phoned us and when's the next interview? So that money they never got it, their families got it. And they were happy with that their research, because this was over and above their pay, right? Their pay was already going home and they were paying sending it back home. But they had this Western Union opening and we thought, okay, that's one way.
No, that's very creative, very creative. Listen, there are lots of good ideas that you have shared with us, Satwinder. I don't see any other questions. It's last call. I know people are still mulling over and thinking through this. A few notes of appreciation in the chat box for you, Satwinder. So at this point, I wanted to say thank you for this wonderful session. And thank you everyone for joining us. Just so you know, the presentation will be made available on the ICOI website in the coming weeks. And please also look out for our upcoming sessions. Want to make sure that you know about our next session. It's on same time, same sort of day on February 25th. So 10 a.m. February 25th, Friday, 10 a.m. is our time. The title is Consent Law, Disability Rights and Research Inclusion. So it's all about the legal side of ethical practice around research. I think it's going to be quite interesting, as interesting as this one. And it's by Krista James from the Canadian Center for Elder Law. So that's for the next session. Thank you once again, and take care, and we'll hopefully all see you on February 25th.
Yes, thank you.